Alright, so in this video I will replace the plastic gears in the stock servo of the truck and install these metal gears, and along with that I also have this heavy duty servo saver spring with the steel linkage. So let's see how to take apart the servo and upgrade the truck. So first I'll remove the batteries so that it's easier to work on the truck. These are the batteries that I'm using for my X-Maxx GNB 4S LiPo battery, 5000 milliamp hour, and they come with XT90 connector. And because the batteries are a bit short, I've used a couple of foam adhesive tape to provide some cushioning and secure the fitting. Now, in order to remove the servo which is on the underside, we have to remove a lot of screws actually. So we need to remove the screws which hold the front bulkhead to the center chassis, and there are 4 screws on the bottom center skid plate which have to be separated. So these are the screws that we have to remove. First is over here, then these 2 screws, and the one that holds the receiver wires in place. That's if you want to remove the servo all the way. In total we have to remove 8 screws. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 2.5mm hex wrench. We need to remove the antenna tube. It's always a hassle to remove this top receiver cover. Now we need to remove the servo wire from here, so which is on channel 1. And yes, I'm using a Dumbo RC receiver because for some reason the Traxxas receiver that I got with the truck was faulty. So the servo wire has been disconnected from the receiver, and I'll also have to disconnect the steering linkage from the servo saver assembly. So with the 2mm hex wrench I'll remove this screw and place this somewhere safely so that I don't lose it. Now it's time to flip the truck. We need to separate or remove the first 4 screws on the skid plate so that the front bulkhead or the assembly can be separated from the center chassis. So using the 2.5mm hex wrench, guys, if you are still watching this video, please subscribe so that you can support my content and I can post more videos. Alright, so from all the information that's on the website or YouTube on how to separate the front section of the X-Maxx, I've removed the wheel so that it's easier to work. You see, this is the front section, this entire portion. This is the center drive shaft. We have to separate 2 screws which are over here, 1 and 2, and only then we can separate this front assembly from the center chassis. So these 2 screws are actually on this side over here, 1 and 2. Now let's see if I can pull the, yes, so that is how it's supposed to be. Here's the center drive shaft. Doesn't feel very hefty or heavy, just an aluminum hollow pipe, which I think is easy to bend. So here's the servo that I have to work on. So to remove the servo, again I'm using 2.5mm hex wrench, and I'll remove the 3 screws that hold the servo in place. So here's a servo, Traxxas 2085. It's absolutely shame and utterly disgraceful that for $1,000 truck, Traxxas is giving you a plastic gear servo. It's absolutely pity and shameful is all I can say. So then to replace the plastic gears in the servo, I'll have to remove the servo horn, and I'll need the 2mm hex wrench to remove the screw. And then separate the servo horn. Even the servo horn is in plastic. Like, Traxxas does not have a metal servo horn for the X-Maxx. There are a few aftermarket options which we need to buy additionally. So now to disassemble the servo, we'll have to remove the 6 screws on the bottom with a Phillips head screwdriver. So once the screws are loosened up, now all these screws are different in length. So we have like the longer ones on the end and shorter ones in the center. If we remove the top 2 screws, I guess we can just lift the top section of the cover. So we do need to remove all the screws, the bottom 6 and the top 2 screws. This is the inside of the servo, so we can see all the circuitry, the motor and how it's wired up. On this bottom cover we have a rubber gasket, so we'll have to make sure not to lose it. So now I'll pull the upper part, and there's a lot of grease or lubricant that's inside the servo. So here are the plastic gears which are 100% guaranteed to strip off and get destroyed on the very first run. So we get an instruction manual as well. I'm just going to click a picture of the gear assembly. In this small plastic bag we have a plastic part and a washer, and these are the gears. So let's begin by removing the rubber gasket and the bearing. So there is a washer as well which sits under the bearing. So first I'll install this bearing with the washer on the metal gear. Now to remove this wide gear that sits here, we have to remove the bearing which is over here. And then lift it. So all the plastic gears have been removed from the servo. Now it's time to install the metal ones. This plastic part here is very important because under the metal gear we have this space where this plastic part will fit. So this plastic part sits on the potentiometer of the servo and then it drives the gears. So first I'll install this wide metal gear. You'll have to remove the pin for that. Place the gear and reinsert the shaft or the pin. After that, the bearing which sits over here. After this, I'll grab this gear and place it here. And then I'll grab the main gear and place it. And here it's important to make sure that this particular part which is protruding from here, facing in this direction and not towards the gears. So once you place it on the servo, give it a spin and see if the potentiometer is engaged with the metal gear. And then here's the last gear which we have to install. Now make sure all the gears are seated properly and they are connected to each other. I'm just going to reuse the silicone o-ring which was on the plastic servo gears. Now we do have to grease up the gears. I have some marine grease with me which I'll be using, and I'll just dab some grease on the gears. So the gears are all greased up and I can install the plastic top cover. So now it's time to secure the screws and check if the servo is working well. These shorter screws will go in the center. Okay, so now I'll connect this to the receiver, center the subtrim and check and reassemble everything. Now before I install the servo in the truck, I do have this HT steel linkage and the stiffer servo saver spring. So I'll replace this as well. And the spring is quite stiff. So to remove the plastic, steering linkage. I'll use the 2mm hex wrench and remove the screw. And separate the ball joint. I wish there was a metal upgrade or a metal replacement for this plastic servo horn. Here's the metal linkage which will go here. So the metal linkage has been installed. Here's the front section of the X-Maxx. Over here we have the servo saver spring which has to be replaced. So to remove that, I'll have to remove the screws that hold this plastic plate on top, for which I'll need the 2.5mm hex wrench. And we have a smaller screw over here for which we have to use the 2mm hex wrench. In order to remove the servo saver assembly from the steering assembly, we also have to disconnect the steering linkage and the steering post screw. And here's the screw that is over here. So the servo saver assembly is separated, but in my case, for some reason this top plastic part is still attached to this servo saver section. Okay, so there was a bearing which was stuck. Anyways, so I guess you don't have to remove the steering linkage from the steering post and whatnot. So in here we have a 2.5mm screw, and it's screwed in all the way. Look at the grease and the lubricant that's there. Here is the stiffer spring. I'll just and then install it on the servo saver assembly. So I've torqued the screw and the spring is in place. So here I'll install this servo saver assembly on the chassis, making sure all the bearings are in place. And then this metal screw which has this surrounding all over it. Will be installed here. So once the bell crank is in place, there is this bearing which might pop out. I've made sure that the bearing is seated correctly, and then this top housing which goes over the steering assembly. And then I'll install the screws. And then the 2mm hex screw. Making sure that everything spins or rotates freely and there's no binding as such. So now I'll just reinstall the chassis together, and of course before I do that I have to center the steering servo and make sure that the servo is working correctly. So the wire has to be routed through the hole. And then secure the servo to the chassis. Now because this entire truck is in plastic, we have to be a bit careful not to over tighten the screws, otherwise the threading for the screws can get damaged very easily. You might have to end up changing the whole chassis tub, which will be a costly affair. So now I'll connect the servo to the receiver. So once connected, I'll turn on the radio transmitter and plug in the battery, and I'll center the trim for the steering channel. And power up the truck. And then I'll install the servo horn, making sure it's facing straight. And so this is how the servo horn should be installed. And since we are using metal gears, I've applied some thread lock to the screw, which will secure the servo horn. So I'll switch off the truck, connect the front section to the center chassis, and before I do that, there is this gear on the rear side which has to be in place like that. So here's the center drive shaft, and now I'll just connecting the front to the center chassis is a bit of a hassle because it's a heavy truck and we have to align the drive shaft, the chassis slots together. So then I'll install this center skid plate and secure the screw. So once these screws are all in place, I can flip the truck and install the 8 screws that go on the top. Okay, so all the screws are installed on the top section of the truck. So now I have to connect the steering linkage to the servo saver. Right, so finally I've managed to align the steering linkage and the bell crank together. The ball joint assembly is a bit tricky to get in place. So once aligned, I can install the screw. And of course, the next tedious part is installing the top receiver cover, which is also a bit of a hassle if you ask me. So everything is assembled and good to go. So these were some of the minor upgrades for my Traxxas X-Maxx. If you found this video helpful or informative, please make sure to like it and subscribe to my channel if you are new. In the next video, I'll be bashing this truck and making some action videos. So thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.